Vice President Kamala Harris was blasted on social media after she suggested it's almost impossible for rural voters to photocopy their IDs. When asked if she would possibly support compromising on voter ID laws, here's what she had to say.
Because in some people's mind, that means, well, you're going to have to Xerox or photocopy your ID to send it in to prove you are who you are. Well, there are a whole lot of people, especially people who live in rural communities, who don't. There's no Kinko's, there's no Office Max near them. People have to understand that when we're talking about voter ID laws, be clear about who you have in mind and what would be required of them to prove who they are.
As though the blight of strip malls hasn't touched every corner of this country.
As also libraries. But great friend of the show, journalist and co-founder of Inquire More, Zaid Jilani, joins us now to discuss the remarks and the Twitter shockwave that ensued. Zaid, welcome to Rising.
Yeah, great to be here.
So let's separate the two issues here. On the one hand, every extra step that you require somebody to stuff into an envelope, every time you make somebody leave the house or the apartment to collect more information to send back to vote, is just necessarily going to make it more of a hassle and is going to reduce voting participation. That's my point A. My point B is it doesn't seem like she's right about it being that difficult to find a copying machine, in rural America. So can you take both A and B there?
Yeah, I mean, there's there's sort of a funny thing about this whole debate in that I think that Republicans have this idea that there's an enormous amount of voter fraud. There's a lot of people voting who aren't who they say they are, or they're voting multiple times, so on and so forth. And Democrats have the idea that any of these anti-voter fraud measures, people are too stupid to kind of do all these steps, and there's going to be a massive amount of suppression. Whereas it's kind of like overhyped. Like, there isn't that much voter fraud. And second, most of the measures that have been put in place around voter fraud over the past, 10 or 20 years, like voter ID, didn't do that much to suppress the vote, actually. Like, people who've studied this, I think there was a Harvard study recently that showed that voter ID didn't really do much to prevent voter fraud because there wasn't that much, and it didn't do that much to suppress the vote. It had no meaningful impact on voter turnout. And I think that isn't to say that every single restriction that is passed in the future or safeguard, if you're a Republican, you might view it that way, wouldn't impact voter turnout or wouldn't impact voter fraud. But it is to say that sometimes these debates are way too overhyped. And I think particularly what Harris is trying to navigate here is also a space where some Democrats are saying voter ID might be okay now because they may need Joe Manchin's vote to get certain voting reforms through the Senate, and Joe Manchin's okay with voter ID at some level. And you saw Reverend Warnock, as a new senator from Georgia, come out and say he's not opposed to voter ID anymore. So, I think to be fair to Harris, she's trying to navigate a minefield. So.
Yeah. That I'm curious from your perspective. Voter ID at the polls is one thing, because even in non-voter ID states, if you notice, a lot of voters just pull their IDs out. Everybody assumes you need to give ID at a polling place, even if that's not the law. But voter ID by mail is a little bit trickier because you mailed the thing to the person's address. At this point, it does seem like you're just trying to hassle people.
Well, it could be a hassle. I mean, the thing is that it depends on the state and the legislation. For instance, in Georgia, what they were doing before was signature matching. And Democrats complained a lot about signature matching because they said that it would be higher rates of African Americans or Latinos wouldn't pass it, even though very few people wouldn't be able to do it. But they would say the rates are higher. So the Republicans were okay, we'll have you write down your ID number instead, as opposed to the signature matching. Like I said, I don't think voter fraud is a huge problem. So I don't necessarily think any of these measures are that necessary or needed. But given the fact that the ones that were in place before were also problematized, I feel like the Republicans in Georgia actually tried to move towards something they thought was a compromise. And it's funny, a lot of the companies that when it ended up denouncing their laws, they lobbied during the process for that particular reform because they thought it would be less of a hassle than some of the other ones that the Republicans were considering, which was ending no excuse absentee balloting, for instance, which they didn't do. Georgia tends to let you use an absentee ballot whenever you want, and they maintained that. So I don't know. I think Ryan has a point. There is a certain level of just Republican-based paranoia about voter fraud that motivates them to put into place a bunch of measures that probably aren't needed. But sometimes the measures really aren't that much of a hassle as they're portrayed. I mean, I've been hearing since Georgia Democrats, I think, walked out of the session in the early 2000s about how mad they were about voter ID. But at the end of the day, like, I don't think anyone's even trying to repeal voter ID in Georgia anymore because they figured out it's not that big of a deal. Is that going to be the case with the newer kind of regulations put in place? We'll have to see. My inclination is not to make it harder to vote, obviously, but that doesn't necessarily mean that every single thing be as big of a hurdle as someone like Kamala Harris was describing. But
yeah, and what I see in that clip is just how bad, on a purely political level, Kamala Harris is in those minefields. As you said, Zed, like, she can be really effective sometimes, occasionally on offense, but when she's on defense, she's like totally stammers her way through answers and is talentless in answering some of those questions. And that brings us to another interesting piece of information we wanted to discuss with you, Zed. Part of Kamala Harris's fact sheet on her Central American policy, you can see it up there on the screen. If you see what she's talking about, it's Chobani yogurt, basically a corporate advertisement for Chobani yogurt right on the White House website. We've since learned that Chobani has filed documents with the Securities and Exchange Commission for a public offering. An IPO of the yogurt maker could value it at more than $10 billion, according to reports. And this is, as we just said right there, in the context of Kamala Harris's fact sheet on her Central American policy. What did you think when you saw that essentially advertisement on the White House website?
Yeah, I mean, it was a little awkward. To be fair to her, I think this was part of her initiative. So, like, back in May, they had met with CEOs who committed to some level of investment in, like, the Northern Triangle countries, so like El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras. Chobani was one of them, right? So, like, putting this documentation up there about, like, what the companies represent, what they're trying to do, you know, I kind of see it from that point of view, although obviously it does look very gaudy on an actual official government release and website. You know, it's part of the wider strategy. Like, she was handed this portfolio of dealing with the border, right? And it's kind of like an impossible issue at this point. We've had 3 presidents in a row try to pass some type of immigration reform, and they failed at it. And, you know, the question is, like, did they hand her this portfolio to kind of, you know, was it designed to fail, right? Like, is this a way to, like, marginalize her political aspirations or not? I don't have a strong opinion about that. I have no inside information, but it is something where I think Harris has been somewhat underprepared. You can see that in some of the ways that she talks about the issue, or, like, you know, how she was being harangued to go to the border and she didn't really have a plan to do so. So yeah, I don't know how she's going to manage or handle an issue that seems like impossible to solve in U.S. politics right now. But
Zed, we also wanted to talk to you about a story that you recently published. We put it up here. Yeah, actually, in FoxNews.com. Was this your first Fox piece?
Yeah, basically it was a short documentary. So if readers go on there, you can go up there, and I think it's about a 10-minute piece. And it covers something that's happening in Morgantown, West Virginia, which is that, I don't know if viewers remember this, but you may recall that Mylan Pharmaceuticals was a company that had gotten in a lot of trouble for price gouging around the EpiPen. Mylan actually merged with another company that was a subsidiary of Pfizer last year. And as part of that merger, the CEO of the company, who was Heather Bresch's Joe Manchin's daughter, got a $30 million golden parachute. After getting that golden parachute, the company went through a bunch of global restructuring, and they decided actually to outsource a lot of their manufacturing in Morgantown, West Virginia, to India and Australia. This is a huge deal for the town because Mylan was actually founded in that area. You know, it's a hometown company in Morgantown. If you go to, like, the grave of the founder of Mylan, who's Mylan Pushkar, it's a very revered site. Everyone talks about him as if he's a saint. But this is the story of what's happened in place after place in America, which is that you have a hometown company. It's very loyal to the people. Everyone loves the founders. They donate a lot to schools, to charities, so on and so forth. But then the company gets ambitious, right? It starts to have global headquarters, shareholders. It globalizes and merges with much larger companies. It should be noted that the Republican commissioners on the FTC were the ones who allowed the merger. They typically do allow these big drug company mergers. And then what happens is the company loses its loyalty to the people who founded it and helped it grow and gave it a safe haven to kind of grow out into being the company that it was. And 1,500 workers in that region will be losing their jobs. And Morgantown's a little bit better off than some of the other parts of West Virginia. WVU, the big university, is based there. So they have a little bit more of a diversified economy. but it's still expected to be a big hit. I think not only will those workers lose their jobs due to this, but you're also going to see a ripple effect in the local economy, because these are some of the only good middle-class jobs in that sort of north, central, West Virginia region. And yeah, I think that's the main reason we wanted to make this documentary. We really wanted to show people what it's like when we continue to have these waves of mergers followed by outsourcing, particularly in some poorer regions of America like Appalachia and the Midwest.
No, go ahead.
No, go for it.
Yeah, no, it to me it shows how this kind of the mythology of this parochial mom and pop capitalism just can't compete with real actual capitalism, and that you can have a founder who loves Morgantown deeply, and as long as that founder is alive and in control of the company, he's going to make sure that the company stays there, benefits the workers, benefits the community. But people don't live forever. Capital does live forever, and so as soon as he as soon as he passed on, you start seeing the shift in that direction. Joe Manchin's daughter, as you said, ran it for a while, but then cashed out and sold it globally without kind of state support and without federal government support of this parochial capitalism. It's just going to get sucked out to, what did you say, in India and Australia.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, the element of global competition, I think, is instructive in this case study particularly.
And you have to remember, we just went through the whole COVID period saying we need to manufacture these pharmaceutical products and medical products in the United States because we don't know when there will be another crisis and there's national security issues. And yet this continues to go on, right? We don't really have any kind of industrial policy designed to prevent this right now. We talk about it every election, but we haven't figured out a good solution to this yet. So.
But it shouldn't be that hard. We have a $4 to $6 trillion infrastructure package coming that hinges on the vote of a West Virginia senator. If he can't figure out a way to save 1,500 jobs and save the economic life of West Virginia.
It's in the documentary that the union leader met with Manchin, and Manchin's like, "Oh, you guys make penicillin over there." He's like, "We haven't made penicillin over there since the 1990s." He didn't pay very close attention to this issue, and it's been 6 months since the closure was announced. So yeah, it is. A lot of this really is on Manchin, and the fact that he hasn't been able to step up the way that someone should when this is happening in their state. So,
Zaid, thank you so much for your time and for your reporting on this issue.
thanks.
Coming up, Kentucky Senate candidate Charles Booker discusses his run against Senator Rand Paul when Rising returns.